Well, welcome to another episode of Farm Policy Minute. Today we're going to be talking about the seed cotton decision aid that we've developed here at Ag Food Policy Center. With me today is Hank Nelson, one of our graduate students who has been manning the help desk and answering lots of phone calls. So I'm going to be talking to him about some of the questions we get as we go through the decision aid. It's something that you log on and you go through it live, but for today's purposes we've made some screen captures. The first thing you need to know is you can access it through our website at www.afpc.tamu.edu. And on this screen in particular, you know that right at the top left it says 2018 Generic Base Decision Aid. You click on that and then you get started. You have to answer a question that says you agree that we're doing this for educational purposes to use the tool. And then once you do that, it jumps into the screen where you would fill out the form that we have here. And so I'm going to go through a couple of one sheet, and then I'm going to talk to Hank a little bit about some of the questions. So the first thing that we get asked is this by farm number? Is this for my whole operation? And basically you would run through and answer every question on this form for each FSA farm number you have. So for this example, FSA farm number 123, the state is Texas, the county is Brazos. The important part about that is, depending upon where you're located, there's some preloaded data in the decision aid that's you won't have to go find. We've already obtained it from FSA, so it's the official data. And so that's why we need you to pick the right state and county for your operation. And the way this program works, the county you pick is your administrative county. It is not the county the farm is in. It is where you actually do business with FSA. And that's the way we've been doing programs for quite some time. The thing that we're going to be talking about today is you've gotten a letter, more than likely, from FSA that says here's the farms you have generic base on, and here are the planted acres of the crops during the relevant time period. There's two relevant time periods for this decision aid. The first one is for planted acres, and it's 2009 to 2012. And the second relevant time period is for the potential to update your yields, and that is 2008 to 2012. And you can see on this form, we go ahead and ask you for 2008 planted acres. It's not used anywhere. It's just for completeness, and we just left it out initially. We were getting a lot of questions about why we didn't have to provide that, so it was easier to put it in there. One of the things you have to do is once you get your letter, now I'm going to turn and ask Hank the million-dollar question that he's been getting more often than not. Farmers know that we have this decision aid, and so they call. They have the letter in hand, and they call and they say, "What's the question they ask?" It's normally, "What else do you need?" And so what do you tell them?
Was to start, the first question and the hardest question for most people to answer is the yield. So they need to get with their crop insurance provider probably to prove up the yields, and really that for some people that doesn't matter. If you haven't been planting any cotton in these years, then you know you're not going to get a yield plug or an increase in yields, because you can't if you haven't planted within any of the years, so 2008 to 2012. But if you did plant cotton in any of those years, then you have the potential for a yield update, and so that's the hardest information to get, and what most people don't already have. The other thing that you need is the FSA Form 156 EZ. Most of the FSA offices are ready to give that information as soon as you ask, but that's the only other thing. And both of those, once we have both of those and the FSA letter to start with, that's all the information you need.
Yeah, it's been really, this is, as far as decision aids we've developed, this is probably the easiest one. There's not that much information. The generic base is listed on the letter that comes out. That goes right in there where it says 2018 generic base acres. The upland cotton 2013 countercyclical yield is on the form as well. That is the countercyclical yield from the program for the 2008 Farm Bill. That's the number that would be updated, but that's a lint pound number, so 550. That's the last time when you start thinking about this, when we do seed cotton, it's the lint plus the seed, so you have to start thinking about something that's roughly 2.4 times that number. That's the actual equation you use to convert it. And when you see it, the decision aid, you're going to put in this number. The decision aid is going to use the data that you put in below for historical lint yields, and the calculations are going to come back as a seed cotton equivalent. And so it's a little bit, first time you see it, you think, I didn't put in a single yield that high, but that's right, because it's multiplied by 2.4. So one of the other questions we get, which is the practice-specific stuff. For most of our producers that have been planting cotton in the United States, they have always been in a program that used PLC type yields. Whether it was CCP program, it was the same thing. And a PLC type yield is a blended yield for your operation. So you can have dry land and irrigated, but it's a weighted average yield, and it's always been that way. So when I talk to cotton producers who didn't have other crops to think about in this ART program that we have now, which is a choice for seed cotton, they're not really sure why we're asking about practices. And the practice comes in because certain counties, if 25%, at least 25% is either dry land or irrigated, meaning that the other percentages is the other one, then they can be a split practice, and you could have irrigated ART cotton, or you could have dry land ART cotton on the same farm number, and so those calculations would be different. For the example here today, we've just done a single practice non-irrigated cotton on this farm. That drop down, but you click the little down arrow, and it allows you to choose which one it is. The only difference is, instead of having one box that says non-irrigated, if you had picked multi-practice, there'd be a box right next to the right that said irrigated. You have to fill in the data for that. But in terms of the form you get from FSA, you're going to get those. If there's any cotton been planted, you're going to get the acreages on the left-hand side of that box. And then from your insurance provider or anywhere you can prove up records, as Hank said earlier, you're going to get those yields. And once you have that, you've already answered one of the two questions that you have to go through on this decision aid. Are there any other questions that we get off of this form that you can think of?
This part, I think that's it. I think that's going to be it.
When we go down the page, so it's one continuous page. I'm showing you slides here, but once you've put in that information, you've already answered half of it. So base reallocation option 1, and there's an option 2. The law allows you to have option 1 and option 2, and so we calculate option 1 first, which is the simplest. And you can tell from this screen that we have clicked on hide worksheet or unhide the worksheet and showed you the actual calculations. When you see it the first time, you're going to say, well, it just gave us results. And then if you click on, I believe it says show results otherwise, then you can see what we have here. But when you go through the screens, it's pretty simple. It's done the calculation. Option 1, the very first calculation is you get 80% of your current generic, no questions asked. If you want that, that's what you can have. And in this example, it was 160 acres. The 20, or you can have whichever one's higher, between 80% of the current generic or the average of the 2009 to 12 planted or considered planted acres, which in this example is 137.5. You get to keep the higher. You would want the higher. So your option, if you use option 1, would be to have 160 new base acres of seed cotton. What a lot of producers are struggling with is the way the bill's written. If you choose option 1 and you underplanted, that's the real decision. And I can back up right quick and show you. If my generic acres, in this case it's 200, and I look at the average of 09 to 12, and I can do quickly in my head say it's going to be under 200. I know that I underplanted relative to my generic. So option 1 really isn't going to give me a chance to keep all my base acres. All the generic would not be able to convert. I can't think of a situation where it would. And because you either take the higher of 80% of the generic or the plantings, and the plantings I just said would be lower. So that's what happens. You get the higher of, you get 160. Unassigned base means that base is going to be kept by FSA. They're going to track it for the end of, till the end of time for each of those farms, but it's going to be unpaid base acres. And that's where this becomes a decision for producers, because I don't know if that 160 is a good option, or is there another option so I can keep all of it, and that is option 2 that we'll talk about in a second. Under the payment yield portion of this sheet, you put in 5 years of yields. The simple average of that was 595. If there was any yield below that, you can use the yield plug, which in this case is 512 for Brazos County. And then those numbers then converted by, multiplied by 2.4 to the potential updated yield could be 1285 versus the old. If you use the old yield, it would be 1320. Obviously in this case, you want whichever one is going to be the highest, so you'd use the old yield in this case, and you would not update. At least you had the opportunity to see if you could. And so in our tool, we assume you're going to take the higher, which is what most reasonable people would do. When people see this form so far, have we had anybody having real problems?
The one question is, and it's kind of a nuance in the formula, but the potential updated payment yield cell, that's taking, again, the simple average of the historic yield times 2.4, and then it's 90% of that.
Right.
So that's one little, just to make sure as you're checking on your calculator, and it might seem like it's wrong, give us a call if it's still something doesn't work out, but you have to not forget to multiply it by 90%.
Right. It's in the rules, and in fact, people ask, how did they come up with this way of updating the yields? And it's exactly the same legislative language that was used for every other crop in the 2014 Farm Bill. So they're just applying what the rules were for every other crop in the current Farm Bill to seed cotton. So we're going to go on to the next slide, option 2. So far on option 1, if you wanted to either option, you're going to lose base acre. Either the first part of option 1 or the second part of option 1, you would have less than your generic now. What I tell a producer is option 2 is the thing that allows you not to lose any base acres. It just may allocate, because option 2 allocates all your generic based on what your percentage of the each crop that you did plant over that 09 to 12 period. So you will not have any unassigned acres under option 2 in any circumstance, unless you just didn't plant anything on that farm for those 09 to 12 period. So when you look at option 2, you have to look and you have to add crops that you did plant. In this example that we put together, we had one other crop planted. It was corn, and it was non-irrigated corn. They had chosen ARC. It's important for calculating payments. You'll see in a little bit. So you need to know which choice you made on all these crops, and it doesn't factor. You will not decrease the corn base, but for purposes of just looking at your total base on the farm, you could put in the 100 acres of base for corn currently, prior to any kind of reallocation, and then you put the planted acres each of those 4 years. Once you've done that, across the bottom it shows you. Remember, generic base was 200. That's going to be reassigned somehow. And then existing base of corn was 100. So when you go to the middle set of numbers, based on what was presented, what was planted over that time period, the ratio of it was 91.67% of it was into. I'm sorry, about half of it was in seed cotton, and about the other half, a little bit more than the other half, was in corn. So you have a little bit, it's weighted a little bit towards corn if you wanted to pick option 2. And so your 200 base acres would be allocated out. You'd now have 91.67 of seed cotton, and sum the 100 plus 108 gives you 208.33 of corn. When you go through this, a lot of people say, well, I want to change my corn. I want it all in cotton. Well, you can't. This is all about, you have all these other bases. They will not change. They could go up, but they won't. You can't move them out of those crops. This is about allocating generic acres to other crops, whether it be seed cotton, because generic acres are going away soon. So, do we get very many questions about this part?
The last part you just mentioned is the big question. So why am I not seeing payments on the existing base? So column 1, which is the base acres that, as Dr. Outlaw just explained, aren't going to change in this process. So the payment calculator, again, will not show payments on those base acres. And if you look at the numbers closely on this table, and then you look closely down as we get to the results, you'll see that those base acres aren't even figured into the results, and that's because the intention isn't to just calculate payments on acres.
Well, so once you get to this part, frankly, a lot of producers were asking the question, I don't know how to reallocate those. I know that I have a choice. I could have 160 acres of seed cotton, or I could have 91.67 and move the rest of it to corn. So we started getting asked the question, kind of after we had built the decision aid, of which one's going to pay the best. And so to do that, we have to ask you questions about what do you think the prices are going to be. And on this particular sheet, for every crop that you had on the operation, where you clicked and added a crop, we just clicked and added corn. So you have to have some projected prices. Our decision aid builds in projected prices over on the right-hand column for each of the crops. And these are basically the 2018 is the WASDE midpoint expected price from USDA for the most recent WASDE, which would be August of this month. I mean, it's announced in August. So, and then the last 19 through 22 is the most recent FAPRI projections that we would have. FAPRI is the group that we work with out of the University of Missouri. Been doing this a long time. When you see this, it's going to shock you, because the left column over there is not going to be filled in, because we're not in a position to tell you what the prices are going to be. We can provide you what others think it's going to be, but it's up to you to put in your own price series. So you would have to type in the numbers. As you can see here, we deviated from the first number a little bit, but the rest of the projections on seed cotton are exactly the same as FAPRI would have projected. Corn, I guess we used exactly what FAPRI projected on corn. The two things I didn't ask you about was, we're going to calculate payments off of for each of the program crops. So we do go ahead and ask you the PLC yield will be plugged in for your seed cotton, but you would have to enter it for corn. I believe that's right, isn't it? Or does it come off the other sheet?
You have to enter it for corn, and that comes off the 156 EZ form,
right,
the FSA form.
All right, so on the far right of this set of information on your screen is something called advanced settings, not recommended for most users. And that is true. If this was added because of the drought we're having in West Texas, and because if there's a lot of producers that say, with some certainty, I know that my county yield is going to be really, really bad, and it might. Some people are saying their county yield would be really close to zero. In that case, putting in a trend yield for 2018, this current crop year, is not very accurate for the ARC calculations. And so what we do is, if you want to use this, you can click on it and override the 2018 trend yield with your best expectation of what the county, not your yield, but the county yield would be for cotton. for the seed cotton. And again, you're going to be putting in the seed cotton yield, not just the lint yield. So if you choose to do that, then you have some reason to believe that your county is going to be below average conditions. And this is one of those things where we have a lot of people, if they don't talk to us while they're using this decision aid, they'll usually call and say, what is that? So again, if you have any question along the way, you just need to call, and you'll probably end up talking to any number of our guys. You might get Hollywood here, but we will gladly talk to you and explain this more if you'll call in and ask. But that's the advanced part. Most people that, for their county, they know they made a crop, and they say that maybe the county's going to be off a little bit. But just be sure you understand, if you put a number in there, it's going to override the trend yield that would be in there for 2018 for your county. And again, it's important to note that. So we're going to get to the payment sheet. And this is kind of where you make the rubber hits the road, and you make some decisions on what your choice is going to be. If you see there's a line in the middle of that table, let's talk about the top part of the table first, above the line. That says that if you put seed cotton in, and your choice was PLC, because remember, and I didn't do this at the beginning, you're going to have to refer to the video, the previous video on what decisions do I have to make. But just remember, there's those three decisions. The first one is, what am I going to allocate my generic acres to? The second one is, I'm going to evaluate the opportunity to update my yield. And the third one is, I've got to pick a program that I'm going to get support on if there's a loss. ARC or PLC. Remember, PLC is a price loss coverage. It's only price. ARC is a revenue product. I will say this, they both have their strengths and weaknesses, but when we have flat prices, which is expected to be for the near term, at least the next 4 or 5 years, ARC isn't expected to pay very often, and you need to keep that in mind. When you look at this, the top part of that graph again is PLC. If you do option 1, you could have up to 160 acres of your original 200 allocated to seed cotton, and there's some projected payments that we have. We analyzed it 500 times, drawing different prices. We use the mean prices you put in there and put a distribution around them. If you were to go up and click on one of these numbers when you have this thing live, it'll show you some statistics. Most people, if you really want to know what the nuances of this decision are, just put your stuff in and give us a call, and we'll talk you through what that means. But in this particular case, the 160 acres of base would get you roughly estimated $33,000 in payments. In PLC, if you go to option 2, where you allocate a little bit more than half of the 200 goes to corn, then you can see the projected payments from that portion to be $22,000, which would be less. And so a producer would have to make the decision, option 1, option 2, which one would I choose? What you will know is option 1, you're losing 40 acres of base, I think, forever. Option 2 is it doesn't go away, but in this case, it's going away to a crop that is going to pay less under the program choice that they have selected. So that's the way to look at that. Then the second part of the table, where you put seed cotton in the ARC program, as I said, flat prices is not very good for the ARC program. So you can see if you put the 160 acres in seed cotton, you'd only get we would estimate over the next 5 years you'd get $6,700, which is a lot less protection than the $33,000 if you had put it in PLC. And the same thing goes when you put that seed cotton, it's only $7,000 under option 2 when you move most of it to corn. producers have a choice, and this is where it's kind of sticky, because the expected payments are best for the one where you lose base. And that is where the decision comes in. Every meeting I do across the state, producers ask me, what should I do? And my answer is, do you want to try to get the most expected payments out of this program choices, or you want to keep the most base? Because those two things are usually different. And the producers you're helping, is this the question?
This is a reasonable example, because that's the case in a lot of situations. So.
And basically, we can't tell you what you should do, but I can tell you this much: if I'm a tenant and I'm renting someone else's land, and I have a power of attorney to make this decision for the landowner, I probably will consult them with this particular decision, because land that has base, that base is an asset and it has value to it. If it's in the farm programs, you're going to be reducing the landowner's asset for the rest of eternity by making this decision to go from 200 generic to 160. Even though the next 5 years it would pay better, you better be talking to the landowner to make sure they're clear on that, because I believe this decision is going to stick, and we will not get those unassigned bases ever come back into the payment equation. And if that's the case, you really need to be careful about this decision. We can't make it for you. We can help you understand all the different nuances, but basically this is the deal. This is the end of the decision aid. If you get to this part and you don't understand, then you get us on the phone, and we'll try to talk you through and make sure you understand your choices. But that's why the decision aid was built, because of this very example. Do you want to have more base? Do you want to have more base in cotton? Or do you want, and aside from that, do you want to have the highest payments? Because sometimes those things don't match. So until next time, thank you.